This is a map with which you should become familiar with which European countries colonized where. This is just a reminder mostly that the Portuguese had control of much of the coast of Africa, and so they were the ones who facilitated the slave trade the most. If you remember from the letter from King Afonso to the King of Portugal, it was mostly the Portuguese who interacted directly with the Africans and sold the slaves to the British and the Spanish, etc. And that's one of the reasons we'll address later why Brazil had the largest quantity of slaves. So, Sociedad de Castas. Oh, I should have said at the beginning that what we're discussing today or in this lecture is the effects of the slave trade on the Americas. And one of the effects in Latin America is the Sociedad de Castas. And it's a social hierarchy that you should write out, and it's based on racial origins. So it's purely race-based. And the color of your skin, the lighter you are, the higher up you are in the hierarchy, so the closer you are to Europe, and the darker you are, the further down in the hierarchy you are. And so there's no way to get around this and avoid racism. It is outright racism, systematized, etc. And so there were two groups at the top. The very, very top are the peninsulares. And, right, it's Spanish for peninsula. So the people who come from the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. So if you were born in Europe, you were higher or had more power than if you were white but born in Latin America. So if you were, say, second generation European, then you were a Creole, and you were a little below or at a little less authority than the peninsulares born in Europe. Next, we have the mixed races. And so at the top of that one is the mestizos, which was the offspring of a European and an indigenous person or a Native American. So somewhat light-skinned, right? A little lighter. And then the next down in mixed race would be the mulattoes. And those are a mix of European descendants, and so Creoles are peninsulares, and a slave or an African. I suppose they could have been freed. And today, mestizo is a term that's used in Brazil, for example, not derogatorily, same with mulatto, but in the United States, they're considered pejorative or derogatory terms because of this racial hierarchy and the way the terms were used to demean certain groups of people. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have the Native Americans, and then at the very bottom, the slaves. And then you can see on the right-hand side the painting that goes through all the different possible combinations, right? So they even thought through if a mulatto and a European had a child, where would that be? If a European and a mestizo had a child, where would that fall, etc. All the way down the generations and the different combinations, and codified this system. And so some of the historical documents we'll read will refer to mestizos or mulattoes. And this is what they're talking about, is where people fall in this racial hierarchy. This racial hierarchy is specific to Latin America. It did not occur in North America and the British colonies. It was only in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And we'll talk about some of the widespread implications of that. But what you end up with are many diverse racial groups. So, for example, in Brazil, on the most recent census, there were 134 classifications of race. Whereas in the United States, I believe we had 8, and you could check more than one box, and that was new and recent and progressive. And so that's one of the effects in Latin America is diversity of demographics, effects of the slave trade. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So some of the discussion questions you should be thinking about are, how is the social structure of Latin America different from other social structures we have studied? Think to yourself, in our other social structures, who's at the top? Who's at the bottom? How is it classified? And how is this different? And go ahead, write a note in your notes because we'll discuss this next class. And then the other shift of this unit and kind of the historical context is how is power and the balance of power in the world shifting during this time period? Who's gaining power? I think it's pretty obvious it's the Europeans, but you might also talk about who's losing power, et cetera, and how that's shifting. So, like, take a minute to reflect on that. Okay, next class, we are going to address this question where we compare forced labor systems in Latin America and those in North America. We just wanted to give you a heads up. You'll use your reading from Strayer as well as this lecture, and so you might pay particular attention so that you're ready to work on that comparative prompt. Okay, so speaking of labor systems, we're going to talk about the colonial economies and their labor systems. So the mother countries are the European countries. They're sort of like the parents, right? They tell what to do and look after, etc. And the colonies are considered dependent colonies. They're not allowed to manufacture on their own. They're not allowed to trade with anyone else besides their mother country, etc. And so because of mercantilism, these colonies are dependent on their mother country. Okay, so there are numerous forced labor systems in Latin America. These are specific to, well, encomiendas are specific to Latin America, where workers are exploited. So I'm going to explain the differences. You have encomiendas, and those were usually in Spain, the Spanish colonies. And they were gifts of land that the king would give to conquistadors and say, good work, you can have that land, and you can have all the people that live on it to work on it. And so you'd get Native Americans with your encomienda. And so the people who ran encomiendas were encomenderos. And encomiendas were mostly used for cash crops. Okay, the goods that were made on them with native labor. Again, these natives were paid, but not very well, and they were taxed highly. So they made very, very little profit. And the goods that were created were cash crops, so meant to be exported, not for survival, right? So tobacco, sugar, etc. Then you have the mita system, which again is forced labor for wages. It's an adaptation of the Incan system, and it was mostly used on the western coast of South America, again, where the Incans originally were. And it was mostly used in the mines, the silver and gold mines, this mita system, where you kind of owed a debt and had to work, and you would get paid, but you already owed a debt, so your income would mostly go to paying that debt. And so that's the mita system. And unlike under the Aztecs, it was much more brutal under the Spanish. Again, the mines are a dangerous place to work, and the Incas did not force that kind of labor. They were having the mita system work on their roads, their agriculture, and we'll get to the mines in a moment. And then you have slavery as well. And so slavery, again, was abolished. Slavery of the natives was abolished early on, so it's primarily slavery of the Africans. And slavery is common in the Caribbean and in Brazil, so the Caribbean islands. There's actually very, very little slavery in Mexico and Peru, which you might explain by them being further away from the slave trade, etc. But there were only a few little regions in Mexico, for example, that had slaves and plantations. And by the way, slaves mostly work on plantations. And so that's one issue. There's a current event with the Oaxacans, which is on the western coast of Mexico. It's this region where there are black Mexicans who have been deported because they're black. And the police are sometimes deporting them and saying they can't possibly be Mexican, but they are. And so when you think about, pardon me, differences in complexion, a lot of this is because of the region of where slavery was. Right, so people in Haiti and the Dominican Republic tend to be darker than those in Mexico, and it's because of the legacy of slavery. Okay, so the encomiendas and the economies of the colonies focused on agriculture primarily. So agrarian, right, agriculture, and 80% of the society, the population was working on agriculture, working the land. Okay, so that was the primary focus. The other we'll get to is mining. There's also haciendas, and haciendas are basically like farms. So they're rural, family owned farming estates, and the hacienda purpose is to feed the society. So they are the ones making not cash crops, but corn and uh, rice sometimes, and squash, and the goods that will feed the society. And so that's done on haciendas. Plantations are similar to encomiendas in what they produce. They're going to produce cash crops as well. What's specific about plantations is that they are run by slaves, right? And the slaves do the labor. Whereas on encomiendas, it's the Native Americans who are doing the labor. On the right, we have a picture of a sugar plantation. You can see the sugar mill, the people working, and the different various components of a sugar plantation. And then I have another uh, example of an encomienda, right? And you can see who sits under the tree and sits on the horse, right? The overseer, whereas it is the slaves or Native Americans doing manual labor. Okay. The next part, an important part of the colonial economies, is mining. Because the Americas have mines of gold and silver, the Europeans right away cue into this the minute they see the Aztecs, right? Pardon me. And the people of Hispaniola wearing gold, they catch on that there is value to be found in the Americas. And it's really the mining where Spain gets a lot of its money and commercial power. At this time, the Ming Dynasty in China, who we haven't gotten to, is very, very eager to get their hands on silver. And so Spain gets a lot of its money by buying Chinese goods with silver. And we'll get to that as well. But there are two famous mines in Mexico and Peru. The most famous of which is in Peru, and it's called the Potosi Silver Mines. And to work in the mines, again, use forced labor drafts, or the mita. So you would be drafted for your shift or time in the mines. And the mines were owned by individuals, by Spaniards, but the Spaniards had to pay their royal fifth. So they had to pay 20% of what they earned to the Spanish crown. So the crown was still benefiting from this and very eager to continue this work as well. I have an image for you. This is an image of a mine, and you can tell from this image that it was very brutal work in the mines. A lot of times the mines would collapse and it was dangerous. The working conditions were not good. It was dark, hard to breathe, etc. But that is why the Spanish enlisted the work of the Native Americans in the mita system to do this work. So make sure you've written down Potosi silver mines, the mita system, etc. Okay, a quick review of the trade restrictions and the way Europeans profited from the system is that only Spaniards could trade with their colonies in the Americas. Okay, and as a result, Spanish ships were often a target for foreign rivals and pirates. There was definitely a black market of, between the British colonies and the Caribbean to get Spanish goods without having to deal with Spain, etc. Colonies were always trying to, profit for themselves as well and defend themselves, and so they would trade secretly or, conduct pirate activities and try to steal ships. As a result of this risk, merchant guilds, which are kind of like unions where merchants band together and work. The merchant guild in Sevilla, southern Spain, is the most famous one, and it controlled the goods shipped to the Americas in exchange for silver. So at first, Spain is getting very, very rich off of these silver mines. And these trade restrictions support that economic policy of mercantilism. So I'm going to do a quick review of mercantilism just to reinforce it, because, again, it will persist throughout periods 4 and 5. So again, there are rules of mercantilism. The first is that nations should not import or buy goods from outside their overseas empire. So the British colonies can only buy goods from the British. The Spanish colonies can only buy goods from the Spanish, etc. And then it's relied upon the Spanish and the British countries themselves to do the trading so the colonies can get the goods they need. Nations try to sell more of their goods and as much as possible. So mother countries saw their colonies not only as a draw for raw materials, but also as a captive market, meaning those markets can't buy from anywhere else. And so Europe had exclusive rights to sell to those colonies. You need to prevent your colonies from manufacturing because you want them to remain dependent on you and your manufacturing ability. And you want to keep your silver and gold and build up your treasury, right? And this is what makes nations rich and powerful. And again, where are they getting the silver and gold from? The mines. Okay, so the more colonies they have, and then we'll see later they shift to Africa where there's also gold, etc. This next slide is just a list of resources you could use to learn more about slavery and the slave trade. There's the entire book from Mekiano, National Archives about the slave trade, etc. Crash course about the Middle Passage, etc. if you want to look into more. And that is all. I hope you have a great weekend.